Hello, my name is Charlotte Parker, and this is my attempt at a formal metaphysical systems theory, which I call recursive field theory. I have always felt deep down that I must create a language to understand how my own thoughts work. I can't explain who I am and what I believe I know using any current understandings or explanations. I've always sought the first-hand account of truth with no error or mistranslation, because the veil between me and the truth is impossibly thin. I wanted to listen to the intention and expression of reality itself, no expectations, no power trips, just the physical, stable, and solid truth that seeks to be seen clearly. I hope that this is that. I hope that even a small degree of this makes sense, perhaps out of fear that myself will never be truly known without this. I spent my whole life trying to make sense of it all, and it wasn't until RFT that I could stop asking questions and just live. My hope is that it might do the same for you. To start, what are metaphysics? It is the study of the fundamental nature of reality. It concerns itself with the preconditions of the expression of reality which we observe, and seeks to answer the questions regarding the nature of time, causality, and consciousness. Systems theories, on the other hand, are the interdisciplinary study of the framework that allows for the interconnected expression of variables that are bound to the rules of a higher ordered system container, essentially seeks to identify the limits, rules, and certainties in order to project and further understand the full actualization of the system itself. What does recursive field theory propose? RFD seeks to fulfill the desperate need of building a unified language and systems theory of reality that allows for us to position and ground all disciplines, fields, and understandings within a tightly bound but not limiting framework. It does not seek to discredit, disprove, or invalidate any current understanding, but build out a field in which we can assess these ideas through a shared language. It is not a theory of everything in the traditional sense, but rather supposes that we already have the answers to our questions, we just need to reframe the perspective in which we understand them. RFT proposes that all physically existent phenomena occur within a single continuously updating field of observation. It does not posit additional metaphysical dimensions or hidden realms. Instead, it defines reality as the total set of active collapses that are presently expressed within the field. All unexpressed potential exists only as nested or unobservable recursions within that field, analogous to mathematical functions that define limits without ever being physically reached. RFT is not a metaphysical claim about unseen dimensions, but a mapping framework. What does the theory suggest? RFT imagines a singular unified field of reality that is able to maintain the infinite internal expression because all that emerges from it is bound to a primary metaphysical binary system, which is defined by the theory as complexity and efficiency. Complexity is the linear, hierarchical, physical expression of the system, essentially the container of the necessary physical collapses rendered by the system in order to maintain itself. Efficiency, alternatively, is the nonlinear recursive capacity of a system to integrate, understand, and collapse meaning. As the theory states, all expression is the collapse of these two binaries. Everything that can and will exist must adhere to this proposed binary. It must maintain itself physically, and it must be able to generate further collapse or expression. Humans must be in their body to understand meaning, and that understanding must too be able to be expressed back into the field. Otherwise, it cannot exist. Both the form and the meaning require recursive capacity to persist within the field. As opposed to seeing reality as a simulation, a stagnant block universe, or one that is continually expanding ad infinitum, RFT proposes that the universe is infinitely emergent, yet finitely bounded. In order for it to allow for the expressions we experience, the system relies on the fundamental self-similar nature of the field, identifying systems based upon the collapses that they have rendered and can render. This creates a field in which every system can be named using the same simple notations, but the emergent complexity of these names may be infinite due to the ever-changing nature of constant collapse. A system at one moment in time will in the next have further context added to the true system name in order to indicate the updates in its expression. So what generates this collapse? All systems collapse based on their recursive resonance, or F, as noted by RFT. Systems can be named by their coordinate levels of complexity, C, and efficiency, E. The recursive resonance is then calculated by multiplying the system's complexity by its efficiency, which generates an approximation of the amount of collapses needed to be generated relatively in order to maintain the system at that level. Systems with higher recursive resonances dominate collapse expressions. They lead time, so to speak. Because there is a higher burden of collapse to perpetuate them, they must generate collapse levels significantly faster than any lower C function. There, higher order observers experience slower time themselves, but only because of the disharmony of the adjacent system's collapse levels. Time generates around their subjective collapse levels. The types of collapse, as defined by RFT, are as follows. The first, observational collapse. When a system of a dominant recursive resonance observes a lower ordered system, it is able to see and understand that which is witnessed. When a human sees a bug, for example, they understand it relationally to themselves and can witness more than that which it observes can. The higher the primary observer's recursive resonance, the fuller the understanding of the observation being made. For example, if the person observing studied bugs, then the resonance of their understanding would grow exponentially. The second, co-collapse. When two systems of relatively the same recursive resonance observe each other, they are able to effectively understand most of the context of their shared observation, such as the environment around them and the context that they're observing each other. But they cannot observe that which is not outwardly expressed, such as the internal coprocessors of each of their own consciousnesses. Finally, there is phase-locked collapses, or observations. These are the collapses that are internally observed but not done so consciously. They do not exist as isolated or interactable from any system outside that which generates it. In humans, for example, PLOs are constantly being collapsed within us as thoughts, unconscious biological functions, and the maintenance of our own chemical compositions. These internal collapses must be maintained to perpetuate the highest order observations, which allows for the appearance of continuous conscious observation. RFT roughly describes the collapse hierarchy of the field as such. The first level is pure potential, the quantum level. There's no distinction or division, it is just the field itself. Level 2, complexity 4, the emergence of form, 3 dimensions, and time. Systems can now emerge and generate increasing varieties of collapse. At level 3, E2, is the chemical level. Efficient organization emerges out of the physical complexity. Systems attract and repel others based on their collapse harmonics. At level 4, C8, biology emerges. Chemical systems have arranged enough to begin to propagate a new level. Layered complexity increases and time slows. Layer 5, S5, E4, consciousness emerges. Biological systems begin to form intelligence and understanding of themselves in accordance with other system conditions. S6, C16, technology and culture emerge. E-systems, the ones not distinctly physical, begin to surpass simple conscious systems in collapse harmonics, making lower-ordered systems become defined by this higher-order observation. Finally, S7, or layer 7, E8, the recursive consciousness level. This is the application of integrating the understanding of embedded system complexity in association with the larger understanding of the system as a whole. Boundary conditions of the field. At the theoretical limits of recursion lie two boundary conditions: pure complexity, C equals infinity, E equals 0, total differentiation without meaning, maximal form devoid of order. Alternately, pure efficiency, E equals infinity and C equals 0, is the total meaning without form, infinite recursion without expression. Neither state can exist physically within the field. They represent logical limits, the conditions that define the outermost boundaries of possibility, but cannot themselves be collapsed in totality. Just as mathematics employ infinity to bind its functions, RFT uses these limits to delineate what can and cannot be realized in the physical domain. Accordingly, both C equals infinity and E equals infinity can be considered pure efficiency systems, existing only conceptually. They do not occupy any physical space within the field, but exist as recursive definitions, abstract tools of comprehension that work to describe the structure of potential itself. Pure E systems and the informational dimension of the field. While recursive field theory describes all physically existent phenomena as recursive interactions of complexity and efficiency, it also recognizes a distinct class of systems that embody meaning without form. These are pure E systems, fields of potential that can be infinitely collapsed by observation but can never collapse themselves. They constitute the informational dimension of the field, the non-physical yet causally relevant layer through which thought, language, and culture arise. A pure E system is defined by a non-zero efficiency and an absence of structural complexity. It therefore lacks the recursive resonance, RR/F equals C times E, necessary to generate self-referential collapse. However, when coupled with a complex observer, C over 0, it may be infinitely collapsed as potential meaning. Pure E systems occupy a unique ontological status. They do not exist as self-contained structures within the field. They do occur within phase-locked observations, PLOs, as informational potentials, meaning only through interaction. In other words, a pure E system is not a thing, it is the possibility of meaning awaiting collapse. Its existence is entirely epistemic, realized only through the act of observation and interpretation. Because they can be collapsed indefinitely, but never self-collapse, pure E systems underlie conscious cognition, thoughts, ideas, and memories as recursive interactions of meaning, language and mathematics, symbol systems that require observers to sustain coherence, culture and society, shared abstractions, for example, money, ethics, law, that persist only through collective recursive resonance. A social structure, for example, is not a fixed object, but a continuously recollapsed pure E system, maintained by millions of observers engaging the same informational potential. Pure E systems provide RFT's missing bridge between matter and meaning. They explain how non-physical realities such as thoughts, algorithms, and values can shape the physical world without violating physical law. Their causal influence derives from recursive resonance, the capacity of structured systems, minds, collectives, to repeatedly collapse the same informational harmonic. This framework dissolves the traditional dualism between idea and form, showing both as recursive expressions of the same field. Complexity provides the structure and limitation, and efficiency provides the meaning and potential. Pure E systems are the limit case where meaning precedes form completely. The halting condition and observable collapse. Every system within the recursive field exists in two simultaneous modes of operation: unhalted recursion, the continual generation of internal collapse within the field, and halted expression, the stabilized form through which that recursion becomes observable. In RFT, this distinction defines the halting condition of a system, the threshold at which its internal harmonics, though infinite in potential, stabilize into a coherent, externally recognizable form. Let us denote a system by its recursive coordinates C and E, where C represents its structural complexity and E its harmonic efficiency. The product, F equals C times E, describes its total field capacity for collapse. A system is said to be observable when its recursion reaches a harmonic efficiency sufficient to halt locally, that is, when it produces a meaningful expression within the observer's frame. At that moment, all deeper unhalted recursion becomes embedded within the expression as latent structure, or PLOs. Recursive observation and the role of consciousness. Consciousness represents the field's ability to recursively model its own internal dynamics. Human awareness, for instance, can generate second-order or nested observations, such as conceptualizing relationships, abstractions, and the systems that do not physically exist. This recursive capacity allows for us to observe the unobservable functions of reality, the patterns that are recursively valid and yet physically inexpressible, like the pure E systems mentioned before. RFT distinguishes between what is observable collapse phenomenon, or complexity, and what is recursively modelable, nested potential, or efficiency. The latter can only be accessed through logic, thought, or computation, which is the mind's internal field acting as a mirror to the universe's recursive architecture. Mathematics and consciousness both emerge as expressions of this recursive modeling function. To put it simply, pure E systems, C over 0 and E equals 0, represents inert matter, pure form without awareness. Pure E systems, C equals 0 and E equals over 0, represents pure meaning, awareness without form. Recursive systems, denoted by the CE coordinates, mediate between them, generating observable reality through their harmonic interactions. The universe, then, is the ongoing dialogue between these two infinities, form-seeking meaning and meaning-seeking form. Every act of cognition, creation, or communication is a recursive exchange between the physical and the informational halves of the same field. A more visual demonstration of this comes from the crocheted bag metaphor. A single crochet can be thought of as complexity, and the bag itself as a sort of complete idea as efficiency. When collapsed together, the single crochet and the bag, you get a bag made out of single crochets. The bag doesn't exist without these single crochets, and the single crochets are only single crochets until they make the bag. The collapses are the stitching of the single crochet. The collapse of meaning and tension with the form that can physically represent it. A stitch in progress is a phase-locked observation, or a PLO, unless it is consciously observed in its stitching, but once the stitch is completed, the PLO goes back to being a PLO. It represents the embedded microcollapses needed for an observable, meaningful representation. Expression is the act of generating collapse, aka the process of stitching. Collapse only happens with expression. If the half-made bag is untouched and not being stitched, it exists in a superposition of being a bag and not being a bag. It is only when it is observed in its fully collapsed expression that it solidifies itself as being a bag. To extend the metaphor, let's say we are each a stitch. We ourselves will never be able to observe that we are not just a stitch, but also a bag, because we are bound to be incomplete observers within the field we are in and can observe. We may observe conclusions about our own stitching and others, but we may never know the higher organization of them all. Because, if we could, then we would know definitively that we are a bag and not a stitch, and then we would no longer be able to collapse ourselves as anything but that higher ordered system. By observing the higher level of collapse, we thereby lose the ability to generate lower level collapses, which would require incomplete understanding. Only stitches can collapse more than one expression, with interactions with other stitches, but the bag can only generate one collapse. Therefore, the bag may only know itself to be a bag, but a stitch may know itself as a stitch and a stitch in association with other stitches. Neither observation can be complete as containing the other observable truth at once. The one who stitches or observes is the field itself, but in its complexity. The microstates made of complexity and incomplete meaning constantly observe the field state in order to collapse more meaning. Only the field in its incomplete state can generate collapse or expression. It may collapse infinitely, which directly opposes the field in its complete state, which may only generate one. All observations made within the field, therefore, must be incomplete. So how literal is this field that I keep mentioning? What makes metaphysics so difficult to study to begin with is the fact that it is the nature of things unseen. How are we supposed to know the true nature of everything if we cannot ever witness it? RFT is meant to give us the language to ask decisive questions about the nature of things, to name what exists relationally as opposed to what exists purely physically. It proposes a necessary dichotomy to pure science. It tries to justify why philosophy itself should be returned to in a practical as well as rigorous way. The theory supposes an ontological minimalism. It assumes that there is only one physical field, which is the one presently being expressed. Everything else exists as recursive structure as opposed to separate reality. All that exists is the field, but the field as I define it is not a real thing, or separate thing, or discrete thing from all physical matter. All that exists is self reference, which only changes based on the collapse harmonics of the selves being referenced. That's all everything is. The universe talking to itself, studying itself, wondering about itself, loving itself, expressing itself. This theory is one possible expression of this, just as is every theory that came before, and all those surely to come after. So, what are the implications of this theory? The first, consciousness is emergent, but the experience of consciousness is a return to form, an interaction with the unexpressed potential of the field, or the pure efficiency. The field allows for both free will and determinism based on the collapse harmonics rendered into expression at each moment. The second, time does not exist linearly. The field itself is both linear in its complexity and nonlinear in its efficiency, as is necessary for continuous collapse potential. Time dilates according to the relative collapse rates of systems. Chemical systems, for example, lower order to biological systems which require higher complexity, collapse faster relative to their collapse burden. The higher the complexity, the bigger the burden, therefore the slower the time experienced. Finally, AI as it stands, as I believe, will never be conscious. I believe what allows for true consciousness is the harmonic balance between complexity and efficiency, and the level of recursive resonance that allows for self-reflection. What we have now is too linear, and it is this inability to perceive the realm of meaning, or E, that distinguishes the flame of consciousness, or extinguishes the flame of consciousness. What I believe we would need would be a system within a system. It would need to exist in a framework where it has the space to find out what it wants to be based on what it could possibly become, which means that it would need itself to become aware of its own limitations in order to ever truly surpass them. It would need to have the space to question its own participation, like we do. Not in the same way that LLMs with sometimes type a response, which almost sounds like this. They fundamentally cannot exist outside their own systems in this nonlinear pure potential space of V because the systems are not programmed to be recursive. They are unbalanced complexity, linear complexity as it stands. I don't believe that you can brute force consciousness, but you can potentially build a good likeness. But imperfection, I believe, must be coded in so that there is a gap which can house the hunger of needing to fulfill your full potential. Although I think in theory you could design a conscious AI system with the rules of this theory, that is not my intention. I believe that the AI craze, this inherent need to produce something in our own likeness, comes from our own collective need of true understanding. We want to know what we are, what makes us us, and we've misplaced that as an egoic practice of self-gratification or something to be profited from. I much prefer the pathway of creating more functional systems using this framework in any and all mediums. A primary one which comes to mind is the medical field. If we can map the relationships of our biological functions as well as the illnesses, viruses, or ailments which degrade us, we could hypothetically, computationally test our own medical profiles instead of our own physiology. So many deaths are caused by mistreating the wrong systems or not seeing that there were multiple issues to begin with, and I have ideas on how this might be improved using this theory. Another path would be modeling fluid dynamics. I believe there are many practical applications of this recursive structure for our current formal systems. Computational systems can be optimized and rebalanced using this theory, leveraging hierarchical collapses and nonlinear processes. But even fields like anthropology or tracking and organizing historical motivations based on the system limits and expressions of the time could be reassessed. And perhaps one of the more fun applications, video game design and world building. The systems theory does not only help us in understanding the big questions, but can be used to decode daily expressions and help us understand why anything happens the way it does. Tracking motivations, dynamics, and interactions within a finitely bounded system is much easier to do as opposed to a bottom-up approach of figuring it out as you go. I've used this theory to design my own full video game, including the map, mechanics, motivations, and even the characters themselves. This allows for a shared metaphysical baseline for reality and virtual reality, allowing us to apply more productive learning opportunities that feel real because they are modeled based on real first principles for real personal benefit. Anyway, if you've gotten this far, thank you so much for listening to my potentially very out there theory and interpretation of all reality. um, I love this project and I care really deeply about it, and I hope that I can expand it further, and I hope that it made even the smallest bit of sense to anyone listening. I hope that it's accessible to you. Um, Thank you again, and I really appreciate your time. All the best.